Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Royce, and today I'll be presenting a deep dive into the political landscape of scaling carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, which is very different from CBR in the United States. I'll begin with a quick introduction of myself, and then go over the main research questions I had for addressing the carbon problem. And next, I'll define the CDR terminology for this project and the various technologies that I considered. Then I'll go over my methods, limitations, and key findings. And finally, I'll discuss a few impactful recommendations for effective CDR policymaking and the related theories of change. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a joint MBA MS E-IPER candidate with a hybrid track in sustainable energy systems and the built environment. And prior to Stanford, I worked in public policy for 5 years at the New York City Office of Management and Budget. Much of my work there was involved in financing climate infrastructure projects, which is the impetus for why I chose a policy perspective for carbon technologies today in my capstone. And for the past year, I've been working in the carbon utilization space at 12, which is a startup that's converting carbon dioxide into sustainable aviation fuel. Given that we're quickly reaching our remaining carbon budget, governments around the world are finally starting to promote carbon removal as one of the main levers in the multi-pronged approach to tackling climate change. And with this in mind, the main research questions that I had for this project are threefold. First, to survey the current state of relevant US policies and assess what are their potential impacts on CDR. Second, to ask whether the current policies are leading us on a path towards a self-sufficient CDR industry. And third, to ask what gaps in public policy exist as barriers to maximizing CDR's ability to scale very quickly. And to answer this, I conducted a deep dive over the last 6 months that culminated in a research paper on domestic US policies. For the purpose of the capstone, I defined CDR as a suite of negative emissions technologies to remove and store carbon from the atmosphere, as opposed to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, which includes technology that are at best net neutral and captures CO2 directly from a point source of emissions like a power plant. And the CDR technologies on this screen represent some of today's most commonly discussed pathways, which vary from established methods like afforestation to newer, more nascent technologies like DAC or direct air capture. For methods, I define a CDR policy as a piece of legislation that had direct implications for carbon removal. And I track policies on all levels of government that are either enacted or proposed but not ultimately passed. But my research quickly showed that the primary drivers of CDR in the US, for CDR as an industry, are on the federal level. So today, in the interest of time, we won't be touching on the state and local findings. When evaluating a policy, I catalog the financial incentives and synthesize each policy's potential impact on the CDR industry as a whole and on individual technologies. And to collect my data, I tracked all policies on congress.gov that were introduced in the last two decades since 2000, using a string of keywords related to carbon management as my search filter. And I then cross-referenced the bill's date with which political parties were in control of the White House and the different houses of Congress to do a deeper analysis. And before discussing the findings, I'd like to note some limitations of this capstone. First, due to capacity constraints, I didn't dive deeper into the contents of policies that did not ultimately pass Congress. And a follow-on study could provide more insight into what elements of these policies were ultimately wrapped up into the policies that were actually passed. And second, the scope of this project focuses on domestic policy, but it would be useful to also compare to other nations as well. So one major takeaway from the data analysis is that public recognition of the importance of carbon management is growing exponentially. For the chart on the right, of the 85 CDR policies introduced since 2000, over half were introduced in Congress in the last year alone, and nearly all were introduced in the last 5 years. And the data on the bottom left shows that, on the other hand, most legislation fails to get adopted, and with only 7 bills out of 85 that are passed by Congress. And of those that were passed, only 1 was under a unified Republican government, while 3 were passed under a unified Democratic government, and 3 were under a divided Congress. The majority of policies consisted of temporary programs to fund CDR research, interagency task forces to do data gathering, and pilot demonstration projects. And these haven't been particularly effective at catalyzing the industry yet. There's also a noticeable trend of US policies providing incentives rather than regulation and penalties, which is an incredibly expensive way to grow the CDR industry without bringing carbon polluters into the equation. And perhaps even more importantly, the all but one federal program fails to provide consistent funding to scale carbon management. And the only program that provides this is the 45Q tax credit. 45Q was first established in 2008 during the financial crisis, and today represents the only substantive and continuous government subsidy for carbon management. It provides a federal tax credit for every ton of carbon sequestered or utilized, but doesn't take into account or consideration whether the capture carbon uses negative emissions technology or net neutral technology. Neither does it take into account how permanent that storage is. The Inflation Reduction Act significantly expanded the program by extending the time window, increasing the credit value, and lowering the minimum eligible size of CO2 capture projects. And that being said, while 45Q policies have provided tangible funding for carbon management, the vast majority isn't allocated towards jumpstarting specific CDR technologies. And the one exception to this is direct air capture, which benefits from special R&D grants and DAC hub fundings, as well as a more generous 45Q funding scheme thanks to the IRA. And while its scope is impressive, 45Q doesn't represent a comprehensive strategy for deploying federal government capital in coordination with state, local, and private sector resources in order to maximize all of their collective impacts. Now comes the question of, so what, right? Well, 45Q provides a blanket subsidy for any eligible carbon capture or removal project, but without giving thought to the permanency of the solution, tax credits can be awarded to projects that ultimately will release carbon back into air, and this method is a very ineffective tool for carbon management. While billions in funding have been pumped into the industry, the disjointed nature of these federal programs represent a very inefficient strategy at scaling up CDR as quickly as possible. And furthermore, getting to net zero requires trillions of dollars in climate investments annually. So when our limited resources aren't being maximized to their best ability, we need to do better in how we prescribe our policy strategies towards carbon management. So we don't have time to cover all of the recommendations in my report, but I've consolidated top lines for today. My first recommendation is to bridge the partisan divide, which is easier said than done. One of the biggest threats to future reliable public funding sources for a carbon economy is the political deadlock that's become common in our modern government. And while there's no easy solution to this, my research suggests that bipartisan efforts can be successful in passing legislation so long as you find that common middle ground. In order to enact more CDR policies during periods of divided governments, Democrats should consider reframing new bills to emphasize either negligible fiscal impact or no net new funding required in order to find that middle ground with Republicans. They should also take a harder approach to existing federal programs by using cost-benefit analyses to identify more Democrat priorities that are potentially bloated in funding or ineffective, and by reallocating funding for new CDR incentives from these projects and not from conservative non-starters like, say, for example, defense budgets or new taxes on the wealthy. The theory of change here is that with a bigger push to reach across the aisle and cut government inefficiencies and costs, we can show both parties that a new carbon economy has multiple benefits for all of their constituents. My second recommendation is to overhaul the 45Q tax credit program and eliminate the competition between sequestration and utilization methods, because we ultimately need to remove carbon from every source. And rather than setting credit values based off of whether it's using sequestration or utilization, Congress should instead create a range of credit values based off of how permanent the technology solution is. And the theory of change here is by reforming 45Q to prioritize permanency, we will appropriately incentivize the market to work towards net zero quickly and more efficiently and more cost effectively. The last recommendation is to establish a new centralized federal climate agency with the authority and funding to implement the government's CDR policies. Currently, federal funding is spread between multiple agencies without effective and clear lines of communication, and this results in red tape delays and duplicative government spending. To create a self-sufficient agency with little to no new taxpayer costs, the agency can be funded through a carbon polluter fee, which would ultimately and finally bring emitters into a conversation on net zero. And the agency would have the authority to create new grant programs directly geared towards catalyzing the most promising forms of CDR technologies, and then combine that funding with investments from state, local, and private partners to provide climate stars with an integrated solution for scaling up their technologies throughout the various stages of the climate valleys of death. And so by designating this climate agency as the main point of contact and consolidating the different pots of funding, the theory of change here is that this would position our country to be better able to commercialize CDR in the limited time that we have left to do so. And so with that, I'm out of time, so I will take questions. Emily.
I love your presentation. As someone who's worked in CDR before, one question I have is like the idea of having a new centralized government agency, and then also trying to scale the funding based on permanency. Would you see it as the central agency's role to do MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification, which is like a huge issue for carbon credits today? Or like how would you think that that could most efficiently be handled?
Yeah, I thought about this a lot. And so when I say a centralized agency, I don't mean that all activities of the federal government related to climate would be routed through that agency. It's more so the agency would be a pass-through for funding to other agencies. And on the measuring, reporting, and verification piece, I honestly think the best solution to that would be to expand a unit within the IRS because they just got a ton of new funding and use carbon accounting as like a new department within the IRS.
I was wondering if you could just expand on what you mean by the credits based on permanency, like give some examples.
Yeah, so the way the credit system works right now is they don't care what technology you use, and they don't care how long the carbon is stored, either in the ground, underneath us, or in a product that's made by carbon, like sustainable aviation fuel. If you were to base the value of the credit based off how long term you can store the carbon, so if you're sequestering it in geological formation, that can be up to hundreds of years. So you would get a value based off of the hundreds of years that's stored permanently underground.
So where would sustainable aviation fuel fit into?
So it would not fit in well because I would personally think it would get lower credit values because the way, at least for the company I'm at right now, carbon dioxide is utilized to create sustainable aviation fuel directly. So the carbon's embedded into that fuel. But what happens when you use the fuel? The carbon's emitted back into air pretty much immediately. So what they're creating is a circular economy for the carbon, and they're recycling that carbon. But they're not taking more carbon out than what already exists.
I have a question.
Hi.
You have these really powerful, very thoughtful recommendations. Can you talk about where they go from here, like from your brain in this presentation to what's next?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, someone in the government sees this and take some of my suggestions. Honestly, the one that I've been most excited about is the idea. Honestly, the logistics of it happening is unlikely, but creating that central government agency, because my experience in local government in New York City is that a ton of the inefficiencies in government operation waste a ton of the money that's out there. So just because you put $10 billion into a program doesn't mean you're actually getting $10 billion of value out of it.
I just had a quick question, kind of a law school student question, but the idea for the centralized federal climate agency, was that something that, I mean, you just talked about it a little bit, but something that, like a suggestion that had been floating around in the political ether, or was this just something where you were like, this is a good idea? Totally fine.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, is it a thing that like people are thinking?
I personally have not come across a ton of stuff on the internet that's suggesting creating a centralized government agency. Is what I've been personally have been thinking is the best solution.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Thank you.